The first time Quinn Sutter crossed paths with the Brandt family, the girl was dragging Quinn's entire tray of glasses down onto the barroom floor at 2 a.m, laughing like the sound of breaking glass was the sweetest music she'd ever heard. That, Quinn would later understand, said just about everything about the night that was going to change her life. Quinn was 27, a late-shift waitress at the Copper Lantern in South Boston, with messy brown hair tied back in a hurry, hands rough from carrying trays, and gray eyes that stayed watchful the way they do in someone who's had to look after herself for a very long time. She wasn't rich. She had nobody waiting at home except a sick 16-year-old brother, and she'd never once thought her kindness could cost her so much. The drunk girl was far too young, her expensive silk dress stained, her makeup running, mumbling that her brother would literally kill someone. Quinn just took it for drunken nonsense. She had no idea she'd just lifted up the little sister of Alexander Brandt, the 34-year-old man whose real name the whole Boston waterfront only dared to whisper. With his ash-blonde hair cut clean, a thin scar through his left eyebrow, and a voice so low he never once needed to raise it to make people afraid. Quinn couldn't afford a cab. Her shift had just ended. Her brother was waiting, but she still couldn't leave a stranger collapsed on the curb. So she walked the girl back to her cramped little apartment, never knowing that 3 black SUVs were quietly trailing every street behind her. She thought she was just taking a drunk girl home. She didn't know she'd stepped straight into the world of a man who'd long forgotten kindness even existed. If you love stories where unexpected kindness changes the course of someone's life, hit that like button to support the channel. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who needs to believe good people are still out there. And subscribe so you won't miss the next part of this story. The girl staggered, leaning almost all her weight against Quinn's shoulder, her high heels dangling from one finger because she had stubbornly taken them off 2 blocks earlier, her mouth endlessly rambling about some man named Marcus who had promised her the whole sky and then vanished in the middle of the party as if he had never existed at all. Quinn murmured along just to get through it, one hand gripping the girl's waist tightly, the other carrying the heavy designer handbag that Quinn guessed was worth more than an entire month of her wages. The night wind blew in from the harbor, bitterly cold as it slipped through Quinn's thin, worn coat. But the girl beside her didn't seem to feel it at all. She kept giggling, then sniffling, the 2 moods taking turns like broken traffic lights. "He said I was special," the girl whispered, her head dropping against Quinn's neck. "People always say that before they leave." Quinn didn't answer. She had heard that sentence too many times in her life, from other people's mouths, and sometimes from her own, to know that no comfort was strong enough to patch what had just torn open. "Watch the puddle," she only said, pulling the girl slightly to the side just in time before those bare feet stepped straight into it. The girl looked down at the puddle, reflecting the weak yellow light, then looked up, her tear-blurred eyes suddenly strangely serious. "You're too kind," she said, her voice growing hoarse. "Kind people usually get hurt." Quinn let out a small laugh, more tired than amused. "Then I guess I'm in for some bad luck." In her head, a familiar voice rose again, the voice that had followed her for years, asking why. Why was it always her? Why couldn't she just turn her back and walk away like any normal person would? She could have called the manager, could have left this girl with the club security, could have gone straight home, where Eli was waiting with a lingering cough and an inhaler nearly empty. But every time she saw a human being collapse with no one coming to help, something inside her chest ached, an old memory she had never told anyone about, from one rainy night when she was 16, when she herself had sat curled up by the roadside waiting for a hand that never came. Maybe that was why. Maybe she helped strangers back onto their feet, just to prove to herself that the world wasn't entirely a place where people left one another to fall. "We're here," Quinn said, stopping in front of the old brick building with cracked steps and a cloudy glass door that was always stuck at the bottom corner. She dug through her pocket for the key while keeping the girl from sliding off her shoulder. "What's your name, so I'll know who to scold tomorrow morning?" The girl smiled dreamily and was about to speak, but at that exact moment, the empty street was suddenly flooded with a cold white light sweeping across both their faces. Quinn looked up, her hand still wrapped around the key ring. 3 black cars, large and gleaming, pulled up tight to the curb and stopped sharply in a perfect line, their engines still running with a low, heavy growl, like animals snarling in the dark. No horn, no words, only dark windows reflecting the image of a thin waitress standing frozen on the steps. And beside her, the drunken girl had suddenly gone silent, her hand gripping Quinn's arm so tightly it hurt. "Oh no," the girl whispered, her voice suddenly terrifyingly sober. "They found me." Quinn felt her heart pound up into her throat, though she still hadn't had time to understand what was happening, hadn't yet had time to know that her life had just turned onto a road from which there would be no going back. The door of the middle car opened without a sound, and a man stepped out with the manner of someone who had never once needed to hurry for anything in his life. He was tall, wearing a charcoal sweater that held the breadth of his shoulders, his ash-blonde hair neatly cut beneath the streetlight, and when he lifted his head, Quinn saw a thin scar crossing his left eyebrow, a mark that made his already cold face even harder to read. He didn't look at her first. His gaze slid over the drunken girl leaning against Quinn's shoulder, stopped there for a moment, and in that extremely brief instant, something very much like relief flickered through his eyes before vanishing, so quickly that Quinn wondered whether she had imagined it. Only then did he turn to her. "I'm here to pick up my sister," he said, his voice deep and even, low enough that Quinn had to hold her breath to hear it. Yet that very softness was more frightening than any shout could have been. Quinn should have been afraid. Some rational part of her was screaming that this was the moment to step back, let go, bow her head, apologize, and disappear into the building. But she had been standing for 10 straight hours, her legs numb, her back aching as though it might break. And in her coat pocket was Eli's last message asking when she was coming home, so her fear had gone dull, worn down by exhaustion, until she simply looked straight at him and said, "Then you should teach your sister not to drink, until she can't stand in a strange city." The man went still. Not much, just the faintest narrowing of his brow, as if it had been a very long time since anyone had dared answer him that way. "Do you know who you just brought home?" he asked, each word distinct. Not really a question, but more like a warning wrapped in velvet. Quinn glanced down at the girl trembling beside her, then looked back at him and shook her head. "I know she was drunk. No one came to get her, and it was cold. As for who she is, I don't care," she said, her voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I don't ask people their names before I help them." Something changed in his eyes when he heard that. A flash of surprise quickly pressed back behind his calm exterior. He stepped forward once, and Quinn realized 2 other men in black had quietly gotten out of the cars, standing a few steps away, their hands folded in front of them, motionless as statues. "My name is Alexander Brandt," he said, "and the girl you're holding up is Nadia, my sister, the only person I have left in this world." He let the sentence hang in the cold air long enough for Quinn to feel the weight of it pressing down. She didn't know what the name Brandt meant around the harbor, didn't know that people only dared whisper it behind closed doors, but she didn't need to know in order to understand that the man standing before her was someone used to seeing others bow their heads. "How did you find this place?" she blurted out, because that was the only thing her worn-out mind could hold on to. For the first time, one corner of his mouth lifted halfway, not quite a smile. "Her phone was dead all evening," he replied. "Half an hour ago, it was plugged in again, at this exact address." Quinn lowered her eyes to the designer handbag still hanging from her shoulder, where she had slipped Nadia's phone after picking it up from the club floor, then plugged it into the outlet near the bar while cleaning up without even thinking. A tiny, unconscious act, the kind of thing she would do for anyone, and yet that was what had led all 3 cars to the front of her building. He held out his hand, palm upward, a gesture both polite and impossible to refuse. "Give her back to me," he said. "And then, after a pause, you'll get home safely, Miss Sutter." Quinn startled. She had never told him her name. The fact that he already knew even her last name, sent a chill running down her spine, colder than the night wind blowing in from the harbor. Nadia suddenly clung tightly to Quinn's sleeve, shaking her head over and over like a child. "I'm not getting in the car," the girl mumbled, tears spilling again. "I don't want to sit alone in that car. Everyone keeps looking at me like I'm some broken thing." Quinn felt that small hand trembling in hers, and the old instinct rose inside her before she even had time to think. "She's cold and she's still not fully sober," Quinn said, lifting her eyes to Alexander. "Let her sit for a little while, drink some water, and then go, all right?" She didn't know where she had found the nerve to invite this man into her home. She only knew she couldn't bear to watch someone who was crying be dragged away like a package. He looked at her for a moment longer than usual, then gave the faintest nod, signaling for the 2 men to remain outside, and followed her up the narrow stairs. Quinn's apartment was so small, it was almost just one room, with paint peeling from the walls in patches, an old sofa covered with a mended blanket, a few mismatched cups turned upside down on the kitchen rack, and the faint smell of cold medicine lingering in the air. Alexander stopped at the threshold, and Quinn saw his eyes move slowly around the room, not with contempt, not with pity, only with careful observation, as though he were reading an entire story from those cheap things that had been kept clean. She helped Nadia sit down on the sofa, poured her a glass of tap water, pressed it into her hand, then knelt to remove the remaining shoe still dangling there. Just then, from the small room inside, came a cough, dry and lingering, the kind of cough that belonged to someone whose lungs refused to cooperate. Quinn snapped her head up, and for the first time that entire night, her face revealed something truly vulnerable, a worry she couldn't hide. "Are you okay, Eli?" She called toward the room, trying to keep her voice gentle. A faint answer came back that he was fine, that she should just leave him alone. And Quinn exhaled, her shoulders dropping for one beat before she forced herself to stand. When she turned back, Alexander was looking at that closed bedroom door with an expression she couldn't read. He reached into his coat and took out a stack of cash, thick and crisp, then placed it on the rickety wooden table between them. "For the trouble I caused," he said, "and for your kindness, consider us even." Quinn looked at the money, then at him, and something inside her hardened. She knew that money could pay for Eli's medicine for months, could mean an entire winter without having to choose between heat and food. She knew that, and because she knew it, she couldn't accept it. "Put it away," she said, her voice even but unshakable. "I don't help people for money." Alexander looked up, and this time, the surprise in his eyes came too quickly for him to suppress. In his world, a world where everything had a price, where every act of kindness was an investment waiting for repayment, perhaps it had been a very long time since anyone had refused his money, especially not a girl living in an apartment where that amount could change an entire life. "Everyone needs money," he said, almost like a challenge. Quinn picked up the stack of cash and placed it back in his hand, her fingers brushing for the briefest instant against his cold palm. "Need doesn't mean I'll take it," she replied. "I helped your sister up because she fell. Not for anything else. She's safe now, and that's enough." Alexander stood still for a long while, the money resting in his hand, and Quinn had the feeling that he was looking at her as though she were something he had never encountered before and didn't know how to classify. At last, he put the money away and helped Nadia stand, the girl now drowsily leaning against his shoulder in quiet obedience. Before stepping out the door, he stopped, pulled an ivory white business card from his wallet, with only one name and one line of numbers printed on it, and set it down exactly where the stack of cash had been. "If you ever change your mind," he said, his eyes still on her, "or if there ever comes a day when you need something kindness can't buy." Then he left, and the small room sank back into silence, with only the white business card lying alone on the table, like a promise or a threat Quinn couldn't yet name. Morning came to Quinn in the familiar way it comes to people who work night shifts, meaning far too soon and with far too little sleep, pale sunlight slipping through the dusty window while her head was still buzzing. She made weak coffee in the tiny kitchen, intending to call the hospital and ask for one more extension on the medical bill she had been putting off for months, the debt hanging over her and her brother like a blade. But when she called the billing office, the woman on the other end paused for a moment, then said in a polite voice, touched with confusion, that Eli Sutter's account had been paid in full early that morning, that there wasn't a single dollar left outstanding, and that even his treatments for the next 6 months had been paid in advance. Quinn stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, the hot coffee trembling in her hand. She asked who had paid it, and the woman only replied that the payer had requested to remain anonymous. But Quinn didn't need anyone to say the name. She already knew. A wave of emotion surged through her chest, and what surprised her most about herself was that it didn't feel like gratitude at all. It was anger, hot and burning, rising all the way into her throat. That man had stepped into her home for less than one night, had seen the peeling apartment, and heard her brother's cough, and within a few hours he had dug up Eli's name, the hospital's name, the amount owed, everything, then wiped it clean, as if brushing away a speck of dust. He hadn't even needed her permission. Quinn understood very clearly that in order to know all of that after only one night, he must have had people investigate her the moment he left her door, perhaps even before the 3 black cars had disappeared at the end of the street, and the thought that her private life could be opened so easily made her feel colder than the generosity itself. To him, it was kindness. To her, it was his way of saying that everything and everyone could be bought, including the self-respect she had struggled to protect for so many years. The creak of the bedroom door opening cut through her thoughts. Eli appeared, his hair a mess, dragging the blanket behind him, but his cheeks were rosier than they had been on most mornings, and his cough had become much less frequent. "Quinn, I feel a lot better," he said, dropping into a chair and reaching for the cereal box. "Last night I slept straight through until morning. I didn't wake up once because I couldn't breathe." Quinn looked at her brother, and the anger inside her loosened for one beat, giving way to something even stronger. She stepped over, placed a hand on his forehead, then ruffled his messy hair, ignoring Eli's protest. "Good," she said, her voice softening. "I'll make pancakes today. We'll celebrate a morning without coughing." Eli cheered, his eyes lighting up in the way only a teenager's eyes can, and for a few brief minutes, amid the smell of slightly burned butter and the sound of the boy chattering about a video game he wanted to play, Quinn almost forgot about the white business card still lying on the table from the night before. Almost. Because while Eli was busy with his plate of pancakes, her eyes drifted back to it, to the raised name and the silent line of numbers, and the anger began to smolder again. She couldn't let this pass. She couldn't live under a debt she had never agreed to borrow, couldn't let her brother get better because of money whose source she didn't understand, couldn't allow a stranger to step in and rearrange her life as if she had no right to speak. She wiped her hands on her apron, picked up the business card, ran her finger over the raised name Alexander Brandt, and a decision hardened inside her. She would find him. She would pay back every dollar, or at least look him straight in the eye and tell him that there were things money couldn't buy, and her dignity was one of them. The address on the business card led Quinn to a restaurant on the edge of the Harbor District, a red brick building with an aging brass sign discreetly engraved with the word Brandt, the kind of place one had to know about in advance to find. She arrived late in the afternoon, just before the restaurant opened, and a large man stopped her at the entrance with a searching look. But when she showed him the business card and said her name, something in his manner changed, and he quietly led her inside. Alexander was sitting at a table at the far end of the room, with several files and a cold cup of coffee in front of him. His shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal strong forearms, and when he looked up and saw her, he didn't seem surprised, as though he had expected her to come, which only made Quinn more irritated. She walked straight to the table and slapped down the paper she had printed from a computer at the public library, the statement showing that the hospital bill had been paid. "You take this back," she said without circling around it. "I'll find a way to repay every dollar, no matter how long it takes." Alexander looked at the paper, then at her, and the corner of his mouth lifted into that half-smile she had seen the night before. "People usually say thank you," he said, his voice still deep and slow as always. Quinn didn't blink. "People usually don't pay money to buy my conscience," she shot back at once, and the room seemed to thicken in that moment. She saw the doorman's body stiffen slightly, perhaps unaccustomed to hearing anyone speak to his boss in that tone. But Alexander only leaned back in his chair, his head angled slightly, watching her with a new kind of attention, as though she had just become more interesting than he had expected. "I didn't buy anything," he said. "Your brother needed treatment. I had the ability to pay for it, so what's wrong with that?" "It is wrong," Quinn said, placing both hands on the table as she leaned forward. "It's wrong because you didn't ask me. You dug up my brother's name, the hospital, the debt, everything, in one night, then made a decision for me as if my life were some problem you could solve, and then fold away. You think money can erase the feeling of having a stranger turn over every page of your life?" There was a moment of silence, and in that silence, Quinn noticed his right hand move slightly, his thumb unconsciously touching the old watch on his left wrist, a worn mechanical watch with scratched glass, completely out of place against his polished appearance. He turned it lightly once, as though following a habit buried deep in him, then seemed to realize what he was doing and stopped. "You're right," he admitted, and the honesty in those words made Quinn falter slightly. "I didn't ask you. In my world, people don't ask, they act, and most people are grateful for that. You're the first person to come all the way here to be angry at me for helping." Quinn swallowed, her anger still there, but shaken a little by the fact that he hadn't denied it. "I don't need anyone to rescue me," she said, her voice softer. "I've taken care of myself and my brother for years. I don't want to owe anyone, especially not a debt when I don't know what I'll be expected to pay it back with." Alexander looked at her for a long while, and this time his gaze no longer carried that cold scrutiny, but something almost like curiosity, almost like respect. "You don't owe me anything," he said at last. "There are no conditions, no price here, but I won't take that money back. because taking it back would mean letting a child suffer just to satisfy both our pride, and I won't do that." Quinn opened her mouth to argue, but realized she didn't have an answer sharp enough to fight against that, and she hated the feeling of being cornered by the very kindness she was trying to doubt. She picked up the paper, folded it, and said that in that case, she would repay him her own way, little by little, whether he accepted it or not, then turned and walked out, leaving behind a man silently watching her go, his fingers once again finding their way back to the old watch on his wrist. 3 days later, at the beginning of the evening shift, while the copper lantern was still quiet and nearly empty, Quinn was polishing glasses when she looked up and almost dropped the towel in her hand. The girl standing at the door looked completely different from the one Quinn had helped home that night. Her hair neatly pinned up, wearing a simple sweater and jeans, her face clean and her eyes clear. But Quinn recognized her at once. It was Nadia. The girl stepped inside with a hesitation, rarely seen in someone born into wealth, both hands clasped tightly together, then stopped in front of the bar. "I'm sorry," the girl said before Quinn could even open her mouth. "I know you work here because I left my coat behind that night, and my brother sent someone to pick it up, and they mentioned the name of the place. I'm not here to cause trouble again. I only came to say thank you, properly, because I wasn't proper at all that night." Quinn stared at her in surprise, then couldn't help smiling, because that clumsy sincerity made her like Nadia almost immediately. She poured Nadia a glass of lemonade, told the girl to sit down, and that was how they began to talk, first with polite little exchanges, then gradually with things that were more real. Nadia, it turned out, wasn't the spoiled young lady people might easily imagine, but a strangely lonely 23-year-old girl who had grown up in a world full of guards and almost empty of people who were truly there for her. "He wasn't always the way he is now," Nadia said softly, both hands wrapped around the glass, when the conversation accidentally touched on Alexander. "When I was little, Sasha used to laugh all the time, you know. He once wanted to be a chef. Can you believe that? My brother, the man everyone is afraid of, used to stand in our parents' restaurant kitchen for hours just to learn how to make soup properly." Quinn fell silent, because that image felt so far removed from the cold man she had just met. "My parents died when I was only 10, Nadia continued, her voice sinking lower, her eyes staring into empty space. "I don't remember exactly what happened. People kept it from me. But I remember that after that night, Sasha never laughed the same way again. He was only in his 20s, but he had to carry everything. Me, my father's business, all the people who depended on our family. He turned into the person you see now, cold, hard, letting no one get close, and I think he did it so no one could hurt him ever again." Quinn felt something soften inside her chest. The anger she had carried these past few days over the money and the digging through her private life suddenly became more complicated, because now, behind that cold face, she had begun to see a human being. "He kept that restaurant, you know," Nadia said, almost in a whisper. "It's the only place my parents left behind that had nothing to do with the other things. He could have sold it a long time ago. It doesn't make any profit. But he's never sold it. And sometimes late at night, he still goes down there and cooks alone. I think that's the only way he still remembers who he used to be." Quinn looked at the girl in front of her, the girl who carried the Brandt name but longed for something as simple as having someone listen. And she suddenly understood why Nadia had drunk herself to collapse in a strange bar, why the girl had clung to Quinn as if clinging to a piece of wood in the current. "Thank you for telling me," Quinn said gently, placing her hand over Nadia's for a moment. The two girls sat there for a long while after that, one the daughter of a powerful family and the other a poor waitress, talking to each other about things that had nothing to do with money or status, and when Nadia left, she hugged Quinn tightly, promised she would definitely come back, and for the first time in a very long while, Quinn felt as though she had just gained a real friend, even though that friend came from a world Quinn knew she didn't belong to. The invitation came at the end of that week, through a brief message from the number printed on the business card, saying only that he wanted to invite her to dinner at the restaurant on Saturday night, after the restaurant had closed, and that she could refuse if she wanted to. But he hoped she wouldn't. Quinn meant to text back a refusal 3 times, her finger resting on the screen, and then pulling away again. But in the end, curiosity, or perhaps something she didn't yet want to name, won. She asked Mrs. Esther to watch Eli for one evening, put on the nicest dress she owned, and went there. The restaurant was completely different from the way it looked during the day. The lights had been lowered into a warm glow. Every other table was empty, and only one table near the kitchen had been set for two. Alexander was standing behind the open kitchen counter, his sleeves rolled high, stirring a pot of something that gave off a fragrant steam. Quinn stopped at the door, because this image was so far removed from the man who had stood among 3 black cars that night. "I cooked it myself," he said, without looking up, as if he had guessed her surprise. "Sit down." She sat, still guarded, and asked why here? Why close the restaurant just to cook for someone he had only just met? Alexander ladled the soup into 2 bowls, brought them over, set them on the table, then sat across from her. "Because this is the only place I know," he said, "where people come not because they fear me or because they need something from me." He looked around the room, his eyes stopping on the old photographs hanging on the wall, photographs Quinn was only now noticing, of a young couple standing in front of this very restaurant many years ago. "My parents opened this place when they first came here," he said quietly. "They had nothing but a few old recipes in their hands. Everything else my family had later. I'm not proud of it. But this restaurant is different. This is the only part of me that still feels clean. And I keep it because when I stand in this kitchen, I'm still my parents' son, not the name people whisper out by the harbor." Quinn picked up her spoon, tasted the soup, and it was so good that she had to pause for a beat. A simple warmth that tasted nothing like what she had imagined a man like him would cook. "You said this was a table with no debts," she said, repeating the words he had written in his invitation. "A table where no one owes anyone anything." "Exactly," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "Not to repay a favor, not to buy anything. Just 2 people sitting down to eat together. Can you do that?" Quinn realized she was smiling, and she allowed the caution in her heart to ease a little. They ate, and they talked, and the stories flowed out more naturally than either of them had expected. She told him that she had once studied nursing, had once dreamed of caring for the sick, had almost finished her 2nd year when her mother fell ill and then died. Her father left, and she had to leave school to work and raise Eli when he was still only a little boy. "I still keep some of my old textbooks," she said, a little embarrassed. "Sometimes late at night, I still take them out and read them, even though there's no real reason to." Alexander looked at her for a long while, and in his eyes was something she wasn't used to seeing in other people when they heard about her unfinished dream. Not pity, but a quiet understanding. "You're still taking care of people," he said. "My sister was drunk in the middle of the night, and you were the only one who stopped. Isn't that something people can study for years and still not know how to do?" Quinn looked up and met his gaze, and in that moment, in the warm room with 2 bowls of soup slowly cooling between them, she felt as though 2 worlds separated by an entire abyss had suddenly touched at one small point, a point where both of them had once lost something precious, and were both still trying to hold on to the decent part of themselves that remained. He unconsciously turned the old watch on his wrist again, and this time Quinn didn't ask. She only watched quietly, knowing that behind that gesture there must be a story, one he might tell her someday. Rain began falling at dusk, and by late night it was pouring over the streets of South Boston, tapping against sheet metal roofs, and running in streams along the gutters, when a soft knock came at the door of Quinn's apartment. She opened it, and went still when she saw Alexander standing there, his coat dark with rain, one sleeve torn and hastily wrapped with a strip of cloth already soaked red, his face pale but still carrying that calm expression to the point of stubbornness. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice quieter than usual, and Quinn asked nothing more. She only pulled him inside, closed the door, and at once the nursing part of her that had been sleeping woke fully. She told him to sit on the sofa, hurried to get the old first aid kit she always kept because of Eli, then knelt in front of him and gently unwound the makeshift bandage. The wound on his forearm was long and still bleeding, but not too deep, the kind of cut she guessed had come from contact with something sharp, and she didn't ask where it had come from, because she understood enough about his world to know that some questions were best left unasked. "You should go to the hospital," she said as she cleaned the wound with hands that had stopped trembling, moving with the practiced steadiness of someone once trained to do exactly this. "People like me don't go to hospitals for things like this," he replied, and Quinn only let out a soft sigh, refusing to argue. She worked in silence, disinfecting the cut, pressing until the bleeding slowed, then beginning to wrap the bandage around his forearm, each turn neat and firm. As she did, her fingers accidentally brushed the inside of his wrist, just beneath the old watch, and through the professional reflex still rooted in her blood, she placed 2 fingers there and silently counted. She stopped. "Your pulse is too fast for someone acting this calm," she said softly, lifting her eyes to him. Alexander didn't answer right away. He looked down at her, at the small hand holding his wrist, and in his eyes was something both guarded and exhausted. The exhaustion of a man who had gone too long without being allowed to seem weak in front of anyone. "I'm always calm," he said, but his voice had lost some of its usual certainty. Quinn didn't let go of his hand. "You don't have to be strong here," she said, and the words came out more gently than she had meant them to, surprising even herself. "In this room, there's no one you need to frighten, no one depending on you, no one afraid of you. Here, you're just someone who's hurt and in pain, and that's allowed." There was a long moment with only the rain striking the window and the sound of their breathing, and Quinn felt the pulse beneath her fingers slow by one beat, as if her words themselves had loosened some wire inside him that had always been pulled tight. "It's been a very long time since anyone touched me without being afraid," he said, almost no more than a breath, and the sentence made Quinn's heart tighten because it revealed a depth of loneliness she had never imagined a powerful man like him could carry. She tied off the last strip of bandage, smoothed it flat, but let her hand remain on his forearm for one more moment. "It's done," she said softly. "You should rest it for a few days. Don't use this arm too hard." Alexander looked at the white bandage wrapped around his arm, then looked at her, and for the first time since they had met, the guarded look on his face disappeared completely, revealing something bare and true. "Why do you do these things?" he asked quietly. "You get nothing from it." Quinn shifted back a little, wiped her hands on a towel, and gave a tired smile. "Because once, I needed someone to do that for me," she answered, "and no one came. And I swore to myself that if I could help it, I wouldn't let someone else sit alone with their wounds." Outside, the rain kept falling, and inside that small, warm apartment, two people from two opposing worlds sat beside each other, in a silence that no longer felt guarded, feeling for the first time that they had been seen exactly as they truly were. In the days after that rainy night, an uneasy feeling began slipping into Quinn's ordinary life, so vague at first that she told herself she was only imagining it. The first time was a dark-colored car parked across the street from the Copper Lantern, sitting there through her entire evening shift, and when she got off work, close to 2 in the morning, it was still there, its windows so black she couldn't see inside. She told herself it was probably just someone waiting for a friend. But the next morning, when she walked Eli to the bus stop so he could go to school, she saw a car much like that one slowly pass twice along the same street, and a man standing on the corner holding a phone, though his eyes kept turning toward her in a way that made the back of her neck go cold. She said nothing to Eli, only tightened her hand around his a little more, told him to be careful getting on the bus, and stood watching until the bus had vanished from sight before she felt any easier. That feeling of being watched followed her like a shadow, not clear enough for her to report to anyone, but not faint enough for her to dismiss. Once, at the grocery store, she turned around and caught a man quickly looking away, and her heart pounded the whole way home even though she scolded herself for panicking over nothing. She didn't know that not far away, inside a discreet office near the harbor, a man named Dmitri Vasco was sitting and studying photographs of her spread across a desk, photographs of her carrying trays at the bar, photographs of her holding Eli's hand, photographs of her leaving Alexander's restaurant on the night she had come to return the debt. Dmitri had been Alexander's right hand for many years, a patient and ambitious man, and he had watched long enough to recognize something Alexander himself perhaps hadn't yet dared admit, that the unshakably cold man had begun to soften because of a poor waitress, and a man with a weakness was a man who could be brought to his knees. As for Alexander, he didn't need anyone to point it out for him to know. He had been the first to recognize the danger he was unknowingly pulling Quinn into. He had seen the eyes of several men under him change whenever her name was mentioned, had sensed the strange air in recent meetings, Dimitri's excessive silence whenever he brought up anything personal. In his world, everything he treasured became a target. Everyone he cared about became a bargaining piece for others to use, and he had learned that lesson in blood long ago, on the night his parents died. He stood by the office window looking down at the gray harbor beneath the drizzle, his fingers anxiously tracing the worn glass of the old watch on his wrist, and a fear rose inside him that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear for himself, but fear for someone else. He remembered the small hands that had bandaged him in the rain, remembered the way she had said he didn't have to be strong there, and he realized with bitterness that the very moment he had allowed himself to be weak might be the thing that pushed her into danger. Quinn had no idea of the schemes being woven around her. No idea that the shadow following her had a name and a purpose. No idea that the two worlds she thought had only lightly touched had in fact begun colliding in a way that could crush her. She only felt a chill down her spine each time she stepped out onto the street, and every night she checked the locks one more time, holding close a vague unease she couldn't yet name, while outside, quietly and patiently, the storm was beginning to gather. Alexander had weighed every option through several sleepless nights, and in the end he arrived at the only conclusion he believed was right, even though it tore him apart, that the only way to keep Quinn safe was to push her out of his life, as far away as possible, as decisively as possible. He sent her a message asking her to come to the restaurant, and when she walked in with the warm smile still lingering from that rainy night, he had to summon every ounce of willpower not to betray his own plan. He wasn't standing behind the kitchen counter this time. He was sitting at the table, his jacket neat, his face carrying exactly the cold, distant look of the man the entire harbor district had learned to fear, and he saw her smile falter the moment she realized something had changed. "Sit down," he said, his voice flat, and she sat, her eyes searching his face. He had prepared every word, had rehearsed them in his mind until they had gone numb, but when he had to say them in front of her, they still felt heavy as stone. "I think we should stop here," he said. Quinn blinked, not understanding. "Stop what? All of this?" he replied, waving one hand vaguely through the air. "The dinners, the meetings. I've thought it through, and I realize I let things go much farther than they ever should have." He saw her face grow pale little by little, and each wounded expression that passed through her eyes felt like a cut into him, but he kept his voice calm, because he knew that if he allowed even the smallest crack to show, she would see straight through him, and everything would collapse. "I don't understand," Quinn said softly, her hands clasped tightly together on the table. "That night, when you came to my apartment, you said it had been a long time since anyone touched you without fear." I thought. He didn't let her finish. "You helped my sister," he interrupted, "and I repaid you by taking care of your brother. That was a fair exchange. Nothing more and nothing less. Don't mistake my gratitude for anything else." The words hung between them, cold and sharp, and he saw her gray eyes glisten for a moment before she managed to hold it back. "Then what am I to you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly, though she still tried to keep herself upright. Alexander looked straight into her eyes, and he said the sentence he knew would kill whatever trace of hope remained, the sentence he hated bitterly but believed was necessary. "You're only a debt that has already been paid," he said. "Nothing more." He saw those words land on her like a blow, saw her shoulders shrink slightly, saw the way she drew in one trembling breath, and then forced herself to lift her head. For a long moment, she only looked at him, as though searching that cold face for some trace of the man who had sat while she bandaged his wound, the man who had confessed his loneliness in the rain, but he had locked everything away behind a mask of ice and let nothing show. "I understand," she said at last, her voice so composed that it hurt him more than if she had cried. She stood, smoothed the front of her dress, and looked at him one final time. "Thank you for being direct," she said. "At least you didn't leave me guessing." Then she turned and walked toward the door, her stride straight and proud even though he knew something inside her had just broken. And when the restaurant door closed behind her, Alexander remained alone in the empty room, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. He told himself he had done the right thing, that keeping her safe mattered more than keeping her beside him, that this pain was a worthy price if it meant she could live peacefully beyond the reach of his world. But when he lifted his hand to turn the old watch on his wrist, he realized his hand was shaking, and for the first time in many years, the calm he had always prided himself on had completely left him. 2 days later, a thick envelope was slipped under the door of Quinn's apartment, with no courier, no note from the sender, only a large stack of cash inside, and a piece of paper bearing a neat handwritten line saying that this was for her and her brother to start over somewhere else, and that it would be best if she didn't come looking for him again. Quinn sat staring at the envelope for a very long time on the rickety wooden table, and what surprised her about herself was that this time she didn't cry, nor did she get angry in the impulsive way she had before. Instead, a cold calm rose inside her, a hard and steady resolve. She had spent the last 2 days gnawing over the words he had said, trying to convince herself that she should let go, that she should take this money and disappear as he wanted. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized one thing, that those cold words didn't match the man whose hand had trembled when she took his pulse, didn't match the man who had said it had been a very long time since anyone touched him without fear. Something wasn't right, and she wasn't the kind of person who ran when something felt wrong. She asked Mrs. Esther to watch Eli, took the untouched envelope with her, and went straight to the restaurant in the middle of the day. This time, she didn't wait for permission, but brushed past the doorman and pushed the inner door open, leaving him stunned. Alexander was sitting at the table with files spread wide before him, and Quinn noticed that they didn't look like ordinary business papers, that there were documents among them that looked like legal case files, but she had no time to think about that. She set the envelope down hard in front of him. "You forgot this," she said. "I'm not taking it." Alexander looked up, his face briefly stunned before he managed to put that cold mask back on. "I thought I made myself clear," he replied. "You did," Quinn cut in, and she stepped closer, not avoiding his eyes at all. "You said I was only a debt already paid. But I'm not here to argue with you about that. I'm here to tell you something maybe no one has ever dared say straight to your face." She saw him stiffen, and she went on, every word clear. "I'm not afraid of your world. I don't know everything you do, and I won't pretend that I do, but I'm not afraid of it, and I'm not afraid of you. This thing you're doing, pushing me away, throwing money at me, building up this cold face, I don't think it's because you see me as a debt. I think it's because you're afraid." Alexander opened his mouth to speak, but she didn't give him the chance. "You're afraid because you can't believe someone could be kind to you without wanting anything in return," she said, her voice softening but no less firm. "All your life, everyone who came near you did it because they needed something, because they feared you, or because they wanted to use you. So when you meet someone who simply cares, you don't know what to do with it, and you'd rather push it away than believe it's real. But I'm telling you now, there are people who are kind without calculating, and the fact that you don't believe that is your tragedy, not my fault." The room sank into silence, and Quinn saw something break open in his eyes, the ice he had built around himself cracking just enough to reveal the man behind it, the man looking at her as though she had just spoken aloud something he had buried his entire life. She pushed the envelope a little farther toward him. "I don't need your money to start over," she said. "I need to decide my own life. And I've decided I'm not running." Then she turned to leave, but just before she reached the door, she heard him call her name, softly, almost dissolving into the air. And when she looked back, she saw him rising to his feet, one hand resting on that stack of legal documents, his face carrying an expression she had never seen before, as if he wanted to say something, and was fighting himself at the same time. And in that moment, she knew, though he hadn't said a word yet, that she had just reached something his money and power had never been able to touch. That night, Quinn lay awake in the dark apartment, listening to Eli's steady breathing from the next room, while the words she had spoken to Alexander kept echoing in her mind, tangled with a very old fear she had thought she had buried long ago. She remembered the night when she was 16, the night she sat, curled up by the roadside, waiting for someone who would never come. Remembered the feeling of being left behind, the feeling that had taught her it was best never to rely on anyone, never to let herself need another person so much that they could wound her by walking away. She had lived her whole life by that rule, carrying everything on her own, never allowing herself to lean on anyone. And now she realized with a bewildering fear that Alexander had slipped in behind that wall, that his cold words had hurt her in a way only someone she truly cared about could hurt her. And that frightened her even as it made it impossible for her to turn away. And across the city, in an office lit by a single lamp, Alexander sat alone before the files Quinn had accidentally seen. He thought about his parents, about the night more than 20 years ago when his entire world collapsed in the blink of an eye, when he went from being a boy who once dreamed of becoming a chef to the person forced to hold up a shattered family. He had buried his parents, and with them, he had buried the gentle part of himself, because he believed tenderness was a luxury a man like him wasn't allowed to have, that anyone he permitted himself to love would eventually be taken by this world, just as it had taken his parents from him. That was why he had pushed Quinn away. Not because she didn't matter, but precisely because she had begun to matter too much. But the words she had spoken that afternoon had stayed inside him, cutting into that old belief, forcing him to look directly at the truth that he had spent his whole life living in fear, and that fear was turning him into a lonely man surrounded by his own power. He reached out and opened the file, the pages he had been quietly preparing for many months, even before Quinn came into his life. Evidence, recordings, things powerful enough to dismantle an entire network he had inherited but had never truly wanted. For a long time, he had carried the intention of finding a way out, a way to leave the world that had stolen his youth from him. But he had always lacked a reason large enough to dare pay the price. Now he had one. He looked down at his father's old watch on his wrist, the watch that had stopped working long ago and that he had never repaired, as though time inside him had also stopped on that fateful night. And for the first time, he wondered whether he could let it run again, whether a man who had stayed in the dark for so long still had the right to step into the light. Outside the window, the harbor sank into the stillness of night. But both Quinn and Alexander, each in a lonely room of their own, could feel that something was about to change, that they were standing at the threshold of a choice that could no longer be delayed, and that the shadow gathering out there would not wait for anyone to be ready. It was a quiet Tuesday night, close to closing time, and Quinn was wiping down the last tables at the Copper Lantern after the bartender had gone home early because he was sick, leaving her alone to watch the place until it was time to lock the door. Eli had been left at Mrs. Esther's tonight, as he always was during her late shifts, safe and asleep, and that was the only thing that gave Quinn any peace when the bar door swung open and a man she had never seen before walked in, moving with the unhurried ease of someone who knew he was in control. "We're closed," she said by reflex, but the words had barely left her mouth when two other men stepped in behind him, one of them quietly turning the sign on the door to closed and standing in front of the exit. Quinn's heart sank. She recognized at once that the feeling of being watched for the past several weeks had now taken shape as a living, breathing threat. "Miss Sutter," the man in front said, his voice falsely smooth as he pulled out a chair and sat across from the bar with chilling calm. "I'm Dimitri. Perhaps Alexander has never mentioned me, but I know you very well." Quinn stood straight behind the bar, both hands planted on the wood to keep them from shaking, forcing herself to breathe slowly, forcing herself to think. She understood that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford right now. "What do you want?" she asked, keeping her voice as calm as she could. Dimitri smiled, a smile that never reached his eyes. "I want to see Alexander," he said. "And you, lucky girl, are the reason he'll come. You see, he has grown soft, and a soft man doesn't deserve what he holds. I only need him to come here, alone, so we can make things clear." Quinn understood immediately what he was doing, understood that she was the bait meant to draw Alexander into a trap, and she knew that if she simply stood there waiting, both she and he would fall straight into the script Dimitri had already written. So she did the only thing she could. She bought time, and she used her mind. "Fine," she said. "Let me call him. His number is in my phone under the counter." Dimitri waved his hand in permission, confident that he controlled everything, and Quinn bent down to get her phone. But instead of only calling Alexander, her fingers moved quickly and discreetly, making the call while turning on the recording function and sending a hurried location message to both Alexander and the emergency number she had saved. All within the few seconds her head was lowered. Then she pressed the phone to her ear, deliberately speaking the bar's address loudly and clearly, saying that someone named Dimitri was waiting for him to come, so that every word would be recorded. While they waited, she kept Dimitri talking, asking questions that made him boast, made him proudly spill out his ambition, every answer from him becoming one more piece of recorded evidence, and every passing minute becoming more time for help to draw nearer. She had learned from years of hardship that sometimes the only weapon of the powerless was calm and a clear head. And tonight, she used it with everything she had. "You expect Alexander to come here and bow his head to you," she said, wiping the bar as if this were an ordinary conversation, while watching every movement of the three men. "But you miscalculated one thing." Dimitri raised an eyebrow. "And what is that?" Quinn lifted her eyes and looked straight into his, and for the first time that night, she allowed a small smile to pass across her lips, a smile that made him falter slightly. "You think I'm his weakness," she said softly, "but maybe you don't understand that sometimes the thing that makes a man strongest is the very thing you mistake for his weakest point." And at that exact moment, from far away, the roar of engines echoed down the night street, growing closer and closer. The bar door burst open, and Alexander walked in, alone, exactly as Dimitri wanted. But from the very way he crossed the threshold, Quinn felt that something was different, a calm not belonging to a man who had fallen into a trap, but to someone who had already seen every move ahead. His eyes went to her first, one brief look, but enough for her to read the silent reassurance in it. and only then did he turn toward Dmitri, who was leaning back in his chair with a look of triumph. "You came," Dmitri said, rising to his feet. "I knew this girl would be able to pull you out from behind that cold shell of yours." Alexander didn't answer right away. He walked a few more steps inside, his hands loose at his sides, and Quinn noticed the fingers of his right hand lightly touch the old watch on his left wrist. Turning at once, that gesture, she now understood, was how he held back something rising inside him. He was anchoring his composure, forcing himself to keep that calm exterior, while a storm moved beneath it. "What do you want, Dmitri?" he asked, his voice still deep and even as always. "I want what should have been mine," the man replied, bitterness beginning to show in his voice. "I've stood behind you for years, doing the dirty work you didn't want to touch. And what did I get for it? You've grown weaker and weaker because of some girl carrying trays in a bar. It's time for things to change." Alexander listened quietly, and when Dmitri finished speaking, he only gave a faint nod, as if he had been waiting for exactly those words. "You're right about one thing," Alexander replied. "It is time for things to change. But not in the way you think." Then he turned toward Quinn, and this time his voice softened. "She isn't my weakness," he said. "She's the reason I finally had enough courage to do what I should have done a long time ago." At that exact moment, the engines outside the street fell silent, replaced by the rush of pounding footsteps, and the bar door flew open as a team of federal agents in body armor stormed in, flashlights and commands filling the room as they surrounded Dmitri and his two men before they could understand what was happening. Dmitri whipped around toward Alexander, his face twisting with shock and betrayal. "What have you done?" he hissed. Alexander looked at him, and there was no triumph in his eyes, only a deep exhaustion mixed with something almost like release. "I've been working with them for months," he said, loudly enough for everyone in the bar to hear. "I turned over everything, the books, the routes, the names, all of it. I decided to end this world, not by becoming more ruthless than you, but by walking out of it completely. Did you think I came here to fight you for power, Dmitri? I came here to end it, for both of us." As the agents led Dmitri outside, he still turned back to glare at him, but Alexander was no longer looking at him. He walked to Quinn, who was still standing behind the bar with the phone recording in her hand, and for the first time since that rainy night, he let his face reveal everything he had kept hidden. "Are you all right?" he asked softly, and Quinn nodded, though her hands were still trembling. "I recorded everything," she said. "Every word he said." Alexander looked at her, and in his eyes there was respect mingled with something much warmer. "You should have run," he said. "Anyone else would have run." "I already told you," Quinn replied, letting a tired smile rise to her lips. "I don't run." He reached out, hesitating for a moment as if he wasn't used to the gesture, then gently placed his hand over her trembling one on the counter, and Quinn felt his pulse beneath her palm, this time no longer held back, beating hard and real. The heartbeat of a man who had just been free for the first time in more than 20 years. Outside, the red and blue lights of the federal cars flashed across the glass windows, but inside the small bar, amid the wreckage of a world that had just closed behind them, two people simply stood there in silence, hand in hand, knowing that the hardest part had passed, and that something entirely new was waiting ahead. 1 year later, on an autumn afternoon when golden sunlight stretched across the harbor water, Brant Restaurant had become an entirely different place, bright with lights, full of guests, laughter and conversation ringing out from the kitchen, where Alexander still sometimes cooked the soup himself from his mother's old recipe. He had sold off everything that belonged to the old world, cooperated fully with the authorities, and though the road to starting over had not been easy, he had laid the foundation for an honest business in the harbor district, creating work for the very people who had once lived in the shadows and now wanted to find another path. Quinn had returned to school, continuing the nursing program she had once been forced to leave behind, and this time nothing could stop her, because Alexander had quietly created a scholarship fund, and she was among the first to receive it, not as a debt, but as an investment in something good, exactly as she had once taught him. Eli was now a healthy teenager, much taller than before, the coughing fits of the past only a distant memory, and he often came by the restaurant to ask Alexander to teach him how to cook, calling him with the teasing familiarity of a younger brother. That afternoon, everyone gathered around a large table, and Nadia, who had become Quinn's closest friend, lifted her glass of water with a mischievous smile. "Do you still remember that fateful night?" Nadia said, her eyes shining. The night I knocked over your entire tray of glasses onto the bar floor at 2 in the morning, I still feel guilty about it, honestly. But to tell the truth, if I hadn't been that drunk, how would we ever have gotten to today? The whole table laughed, and Quinn laughed too. The embarrassment and irritation of that night now transformed into one of the warmest memories of her life. When the gathering ended and everyone had gone home, Alexander took Quinn's hand and led her to stand by the railing, looking down at the water, and he removed the old watch from his wrist, his father's watch that had stopped running for so many years, which he had now taken to be repaired, so it was ticking again. He gently fastened it around Quinn's wrist. "I want you to keep it," he said softly. "It stopped running the night I lost everything. And it only started again after you came into my life." Quinn looked at the watch on her wrist, then, out of a deeply rooted habit from her training, placed 2 fingers against the inside of her wrist, just beneath the watch face, and counted her own pulse. This time it was beating fast, and she didn't bother pretending otherwise. She lifted her eyes to him, to the man whose name had once been spoken with fear across the entire harbor, now standing there with the gentle eyes of someone who had finally found his way home, and she understood that sometimes what saves a person is not power or money, but one small act of kindness without calculation, one hand reaching out in the dark without asking what it will receive in return. The story of Quinn and Alexander reminds us that sincere kindness is the most precious treasure, one no amount of money can buy, that a person's dignity does not lie in what they own, but in how they treat others, and that no one is imprisoned in their past forever, because with enough courage, anyone can choose to step into the light and begin again. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video so we can continue listening to many meaningful and captivating stories every day. How do you feel about Quinn and Alexander's story? Do you believe kindness can change an entire destiny? Please leave a comment sharing the feelings deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your sincere thoughts. Thank you for taking the time to listen until the very last moment. May you and your loved ones always have abundant health, and may each passing day be filled with joy, peace, and happiness. Goodbye, and I'll see you again in the next videos.